I was interrupted by the capacity of the SD card. So I will just sum up briefly the P51 flaws that justify its ranking as number 7. It was known to have a harsh stall. It was capable of low-speed turn fighting, but generally it had a harsh stall and you had to know how to handle it. The other handling flaw is snaking tendency above 350 miles an hour, which was bad enough to force a reversed trim tab, so that the trim tab made the rudder heavier for the pilot to inhibit too much stepping on the pedals, because the pilot had to try to keep the nose straight. Now, to what extent this made hit and run difficult, it's hard to say, but it certainly was a handling flaw. If they had to reverse the trim tab, then it definitely was a problem, which was never solved. Tendency to break its wing or its tail in high-speed dive pullouts. Now, this was a result of its excellent elevator authority. So it's hard to say really, but they never solved the source of the problem and it kept reoccurring. It was a little bit intimidating to pull out of dives with it. Another thing is, probably the most peculiar problem that it had, the tendency of the guns to jam in turns, whether high G turns or low G turns, not really clear, but I have 30 combat accounts that show that after a few turns or after prolonged dogfighting, typically even a P-51D in 1945 will be down to just one gun working, the gun that's on the inside of the turn. Now, this does not mean it happened all the time, but if out of 400 combat reports that I've read, if I have seen 30 or 40 of those where the aircraft is down to one gun, so that indicates that the guns have a problem. And also, I have a report, an 8th Air Force report on the mean rounds between failures. The P-51B was at about 500 mean rounds between failures when the P-47 was at 1,500, early in 1944. And then late in 1944, the P-47 was up to 3,000 rounds between failures, and the P-51 was still at around 1,000 to 1,200. So this rise in the mean round between failure was probably due to the lowering of the altitude of combats later in the war, or improvements in maintenance or whatever. But the fact remained that it had still 2 to 3 times the mean rounds between failure rate of the P-47. And as I say, I have 30 combat reports where at the end of the dogfight, the P-51 is down to one gun working on the inside of the turn. I have no reports like that for the P-47. And I have read more combat accounts of the P-47, and the P-47 usually turns more than the P-51. So this is fairly significant, even though many pilots claim it never happened to them. So that, just to sum up, it's a very high-performance aircraft that was somewhat temperamental, but still somewhat deserving of its reputation, but somewhat overrated because its reputation is so high. Fm2 Wildcat, some may be surprised to see it rank above the P-51, but remember, we are looking only at low altitude air superiority, and it really had an excellent turn rate. The firepower was kind of weak at 4 guns, but it still was one of the most maneuverable aircrafts of World War II in terms of turn rate. Even though it had a flap arrangement, both the Hellcat and the Wildcat had a similar flap arrangement in that the pilot could not set a partial angle flap, somewhat like the Spitfire. But the flaps here were completely automatic. They were under hydraulic pressure. On the Hellcat, they were under spring pressure. but the pilot did not control the angle. What the pilot could do, however, is slide the flaps back without giving them any angle, and this would, in effect, this would increase the wing area. It appeared that it was very effective, even though I suspect giving the pilot the option to lower his flap 10 degrees would have increased this effectiveness. But they were still very effective, and at least for the Wildcat, I'm pretty convinced that the Wildcat could turn with or outturn the late model Zero, like the A6M5. It would definitely either turn with it or outturn them, even though the margins are fairly narrow in this range. It would certainly turn better than the Hellcat. So it was really quite a deadly dogfighter, and which is why it ranks so high, despite being somewhat slow and not with a great climb rate and all that. But as far as low altitude air superiority, it would definitely be one of the most deadly aircrafts out there. So the Mi-109 hardly needs any introduction. I make not that much difference between the G6 or the later models. The later models had major improvements in speed, but since we're talking about low altitude air superiority, it makes little difference. The thing to remember about the Mi-109 that I think would be the least understood is just how well-rounded it is. It's not an aircraft that is the absolute strongest in any one area, except maybe for dive pullouts because of its excellent fully mobile tail. So in dive pullouts, it did prove that it could pull out of dives better than even a P-51, which was also excellent at this. So if it was trimmed correctly, now you had to trim it in advance because it was mechanical. It was a mechanical trim. So if you waited until the speed was too high, the trim wheel would not turn. But if you trimmed it in advance, you could trim the tail to give you an excellent response at extreme speeds. Other than that, its climb rate was also excellent, but not the best. The Spitfire Mark 9 was definitely better, and when it got 150 octane fuel, it became even better. The roll rate was excellent. The 109 was really an aircraft that could do pretty much everything. It was even good at high altitude, unlike the Focke-Wulf 190. So the way to think about it is that it is a well-rounded aircraft with few vices, few flaws, very different from what it is usually described. It is described as an aircraft with a lot of handling flaws and with a lot of... The only handling flaw that it really had was that... At high speeds, before it got the tall rudder, at high speeds the pilot had to push hard with the left foot to keep the nose from drifting right. But other than that, it was really a well-rounded aircraft that unfortunately for it had short range. But since I don't count range, I only count low altitude air superiority, it ranks very high. Even in firepower, its handling did not suffer so much from having underwing gondolas. So even in terms of high firepower, it could rank high. The way I would look at it is that on the Eastern Front, it would be best used as a hit-and-run aircraft without gondolas. And on the Western Front, it would be best used as a turn fighter at low speed with 2 additional 20 millimeters cannons. That would be the picture, the overall picture of the 109. An aircraft that I would say is very underrated, especially if you were to take into account the cost to operate, which was much lower than most other aircraft. If the cost to operate was included, it would rank even higher. If there was any flaw in this aircraft, I would say it would have to be the range, but since the range is not part of this evaluation, I will just leave it at that. If I had to say what was a misconception about this aircraft, it would have to be that landing gear was causing a lot of problems. In fact, if you knew what you were doing, the landing gear was not really an issue. And the accident rate is not different than from many other types. So this is kind of a myth. So this is the one that rates above the P-47, but very close in turning performance, but still slightly better. Its climb rate was not that great. It was about equal to when the P-47 got the paddle blade prop. The zoom was about similar. They were fairly closely matched. If you had to make a match between the P-47 and the Focke-Wulf 490, these were fairly closely matched aircraft, except that the Focke-Wulf 490, in terms of resources, you just have to look at it in terms of resources, in terms of expense to build. It is a much more elegant aircraft than the P-47. It is much more economical, and it is much less wasteful than the P-47 is. The P-47 is really, this is one of the things, is that it ended up being built around an enormous turbo supercharger that it ended up not using. So in terms of cost per effect, definitely the Focke-Wulf 190 is superior to a P-47. Now, in terms of range, I think the P-47 had more range, but since we don't consider range here, there's not much to say about that. The peculiar defects of the Focke-Wulf 190 were its ability to use high speeds. It could reach those high speeds, but it could not maneuver at those high speeds, and it was one of the worst fighters of World War II at high speeds. It had a particular behavior when diving, that when you tried to pull out of a dive, it would sink belly first, tail down, and it would sink for thousands of feet, hundreds of feet, after you have your nose pulled up, and it would impose enormous G's doing this on the pilot. So this was one of the main characteristics of the Focke-Wulf 490s, is terrible high-speed handling and terrible ability to pull out of dives, despite having a similar fully trimmable tail to the 109. But despite this, it had terrible high-speed handling. And so this, probably, if I included high-altitude combat, it would then rank below the P-47.